Hello and welcome to Fabula Celtica, a Celtic Studies podcast.
With Tyler Baxter
and Michael Frim.
Season 1, Ancient Ireland. Episode 8, Words in Stone.
Well, Father Sultav, said Cuchulainn, I have a premonition that the army is at hand, so go for me with warnings to the Ulstermen, that they stay not on the open plains, but go to the woods and waste places and deep valleys of the province to evade the men of Ireland. And you, my fosterling, what will you do? I must go southwards to Tara to keep a tryst with the handmaiden of Feddlmydd Nichrthach, with my own surety until morning. Woe to him who goes thus, said Sultav, and leaves the Ulstermen to be trampled underfoot by their enemies and by outlanders for the sake of going to a tryst with any women. I must go, however, for unless I do, men's contracts will be falsified and women's words be verified. Sultav went with warnings to the Ulstermen. Cuchulainn went into the wood and cut a prime oak sapling, whole and entire, with one stroke, and standing on one leg and using but one hand and one eye, he twisted it into a ring and put an Ogam inscription on the peg of the ring, and put the ring around the narrow part of the standing stone at Ardquillan. He forced the ring down until it reached the thick part of the stone. After that, Cuchulainn went to his tryst.
Michael, I feel like that intro requires some explanation because I don't know that everyone has a very good idea of what Ogam is. And then the scene itself is really interesting, so I think we'll have to dive into what's going on in the scene. But could you give us a brief overview of what is Ogam or Ogham, depending on whether we're going with our old or modern Irish pronunciation?
Absolutely, yeah. That is a really interesting scene from the Tonbo Cuailnge. And I imagine later in this episode, we're going to have a chance to really dive into many of the implications of it. But first and foremost, the topic of today's episode, Ogam or Ogham, which is this Irish word, Ogam in Old Irish pronunciation and Ogham in Modern Irish. Ogam is the oldest form of script for the Irish language. It's a system of dashes and scratches and dots that you would inscribe into stone, usually is how we find it today, though as we saw in that scene from the Ton, potentially wood as well. So these slashes and these dots form an alphabet, and we'll talk about all the implications of that alphabet. Just as a basic overview, so Ogam inscriptions, they exist on stones called Ogam stones. They are the oldest surviving form of writing native to Ireland. The earliest that we find artifacts with Ogam is around 400 CE, and then they were quite common through until, the 8th century, 9th century. Very common, towards the beginning of that range, and then slowly tapering off. But as we'll talk about, the tradition of Ogam continued until very, very late. So that's just kind of a basic overview of what Ogam is and what they were saying in the Ton. So in that scene, Cuchulainn is taking a piece of wood and scratching in this Ogam inscription. So an inscription of slashes and lines to indicate an alphabet, and placing that onto a standing stone. But what we have, the artifacts that we see, are stones that have the scratches in them directly. So we can talk about that scene more specifically later, but that's just an overview of what Ogam is.
Yeah, and I guess to tie this to a earlier episode, we have already looked at pillar stones to some extent, but not ones that have been inscribed upon before. So we've seen, for instance, the Leah Fall, or the stone penis, as it was so wonderfully described in a previous episode, 2 episodes ago, I believe. And here, I think we get that phallic imagery coming in again as Cuchulainn is about to head off to this tryst, and then he's taking this hoop that he's made out of wood, and he's forcing it over this pillar stone in a way that seems to me like it might be foregrounding this tryst he's about to head off to. So just because everyone loves some good, sexy metaphors, I thought that would be a good way to really pull people into this episode.
I think that's a really good analysis of this scene. And I think there's a danger often with phallic imagery in literary criticism of seeing any cigar as a phallic image, but I think it is not a very far stretch here.
My high school English teacher used to say, when is it a burning bush and when is it just a bush?
Exactly. But here I think it really is a burning bush.
I want to now look at a legendary account, or a couple of legendary accounts, that deal with someone who is supposed to be Ogam's inventor, or one of a couple of different inventors, depending on which legendary source we decide to draw upon. This following quote is from McManus's Guide to Ogam, and the original text that it is based on is called In Lever Ogam, or the Ogam Treatise. Quote, "What are the place, time, person, and cause of the invention of the Ogam? Not hard. Its person, Ogma, son of Elitha. Now Ogma, a man well skilled in speech and in poetry, invented the Ogam. The cause of its invention, as a proof of its ingenuity, and that the speech should belong to the learned apart, to the exclusion of rustics and herdsmen." End quote. So what we seem to have in the Ogam Treatise is we've been given the name of Ogma, this god, this son of Elitha, and Elitha's name, by the way, means something like science or art. So he is a son of art, a son of science, a son of learning, one might say. And this is supposed to be a writing system, a form of knowledge that is exclusively for the learned class. It is not for everyday people. It is something that is a status symbol and something that scholars have purview over.
Here's a question that I've had for a while about the Ogam Treatise and the relationship between Ogma and Ogam. Because, presumably Ogam was not invented by a god. One question I've always wondered, and I wonder if you have any insight into this, is which came first? Did the writing system come first, and then this god was created, or this the purpose of this god was attached to an already existent part of the belief system after the writing system was in existence? And so you have this writing system and you need to explain where it comes from. Oh, it comes from, this god. Or was it the other way around? There was this god of learning and wisdom, and as they create this writing system, well, obviously it comes from the god of learning and wisdom. Mm-hmm. And related to this is the question of the name. Which name came first? The god's name Ogma, giving the name Ogam, to a very clear connection there, or the name of the writing system Ogam being attached to this god who's being attributed with its invention.
It's a really good question, and I don't think it's something that we have an answer to, but I don't have the reference for it. But I do remember reading somewhere, it may have even been in John Carey's article about Ogam and about the god Ogma. In any case, whatever this reference was, it explains that linguistically, it's quite a stretch to think that the name Ogma comes from Ogam or vice versa. They just resemble each other. So it's hard to say exactly what that relationship purely on the basis of the names are. They could have even been independent names that were later put together when someone noticed their similarities. And I might lean towards that, if only because there is a strong case for connecting this Irish god Ogma with an earlier continental deity, Ogmios, who we'll be meeting later. If Ogma is in fact a derivative of Ogmios, then he is in fact a very, very early figure and would predate Ogam itself.
And I think the reference you were making was to Ogmios and the Eternal Word by John Carey,
yes,
which is an excellent article and talks about all of these issues very eloquently.
Indeed, I wouldn't be surprised if John is a reincarnation or a earthly incarnation of Ogma or of Ogmios. But I do think it quite likely that Ogam and Ogma were originally independent, and later medieval people noticed these similarities and decided to bring them into some sort of legendary relationship.
They're pretty clear similarities, so you can't blame them for that.
Definitely can't. But this could also be a case where this god of eloquence and connection to writing is just a happy accident rather than so much a idea that really was something that would have originally been thought of, because as we are going to see, things that are written Ogam aren't necessarily something I would describe as eloquent, because they're a little too simple most of the time to earn that particular title, I think. Now, another text that we've mentioned multiple times is, and I promise we're going to be getting to it, it will be at the end of the season, is Gutiérrez, the second battle of Gutiérrez. And in this text, we have already met the god Lugh in our episode on kingship of Tara, and I think we've mentioned him a couple of times even previous to that. And Ogma is also a character that appears in this text. Both of them are related to the Tuatha De Danann, but Lugh is half Tuatha De Danann and half Fómhara, if you'll recall the Fómhara from our very early episodes about the Lever Gavala. In a particular scene in the Gutiérrez, Lugh has been raised by the Fómhara. His mother is Fómhara, so he was born to her, but his father is Tuatha De Danann, and at one point in the story, he decides to move to being with his father's people. And when he goes to Tara, to the stronghold of the Tuatha De Danann and the court of Nuada, who is then the king of the Tuatha De Danann, he has to go through this doorkeeper. The doorkeeper questions Lugh about his various skills, because no one without a skill is permitted to enter into Tara. And among other skills, Lugh has many of these, but one of them, he says, is, I am a champion. And the phrase used for this word champion is train air, literally strong man. The doorkeeper tells Lugh, we do not need you. We have a champion already, Ogma Moch Ethlin. So Lugh does eventually get in through the door after some back and forth, but not everyone is happy with his presence. Ogma is one of these, and we're told, quote, then Ogma threw the flagstone, which required 80 yoke of oxen to move it, through the side of the hall so that it lay outside Tara. That was to challenge Lugh. Because Lugh is super great, he's one of the original Mary Sues. He then goes and he picks up this flagstone that require 80 oxen to move, and he throws it back through the wall so that it actually repairs the wall as he throws it in this incredible maneuver. What we see here is that Ogma is not only a character connected to eloquence, but also a character connected to brute strength, which is a very interesting and unusual combination, I think, from our modern day perspective, where usually we see characters associated with great intelligence as being meek scholars always in their books. But here, no, we have someone who is very beefy and also is very learned.
I'd say that's at least a more common motif in these kinds of medieval European literatures. I'm thinking of the very common warrior poet all over Icelandic sagas, and obviously here as well, and I imagine not restricted to European literature either. This really gives the image of a warrior poet, someone who is eloquent, a wordsmith, who's also really, really strong.
Yeah, and something that's good to be aware of about the Irish characters is that very frequently we will have these characters who are poets, and they're more like what we would expect in our modern day, being more bookish people focused on purely working through knowledge and trickery and sorcery. But we also have characters like Ogma, like Cuchulainn, like Finn McCovell, these various heroes, not only gods, but also heroes, who, even though their primary attributes are about war and fighting and being the best at physical pursuits, time and again, we see them get into these altercations where they are spitting poetry at someone else. There's these back and forth poetic rap battles we get all the time, which I absolutely love. We get characters like Finn McCovell, who has the ability to suck on his thumb and learn things that he shouldn't be able to know through this supernatural gift he has because of either a fairy door he got his thumb jammed in, or a salmon of knowledge that he burnt his thumb on when he was cooking it. And that is normally something that we would think of as being a trait ascribed to a poet or to a druid, but in this case, it's something that seems to be a secondary trait to a warrior. And really, the most famous warrior characters always seem to have this aspect where they're not necessarily described as being poets, but they are trained in poetry. And when I say poetry, I mean more than just speaking fancy words. Poetry has a power that we'll be able to discuss more as we go through this series, and especially when we look at the Fileadh, the poets of early Ireland, in detail.
It's almost like a prerequisite to be one of these warrior characters. You have to be able to summon the power of poetry, of poetics at will, and engage in these riddle battles, these poetry battles. That's part of the job of being one of these really strong warriors.
Certainly to be among the best of them.
Right.
I think we see a lot less of it with characters who are oftentimes more secondary, such as Conall Cearnach or Loigera Buadach, not King Loigera of our previous episode, but these are kind of the second best and third best warriors of the Ulstermen in the Tonbal Cunga and the Ulster cycle, and we don't see nearly as much from them where they're doing poetry. Though, to be fair to them, they just get less screen time as well.
I'd also add something. Maybe this will be cut from the episode because it's really going down the tangent. It's really going down a tangent now. That motif of Finn McCovell burning his thumb on the salmon of knowledge, then sucking his thumb and gaining prophetic abilities, that's a motif that exists elsewhere in Europe as well. Most notably in a story, Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, which is all over Scandinavia and Central Europe. And this character, a dragon slayer, a very clear, strong warrior character, really the romantic, capital R, romantic ideal of a warrior who cuts out the heart of the dragon he just killed and is cooking it and burns his finger and puts it in his mouth and immediately gains, I think it's the ability to speak to birds. So again, gaining, knowledge from burning your thumb on, something mystical, but because of related to your warrior abilities, having this knowledge.
Yes, and I will not expand on that here because I think we will come back to it again, but I will say that there's also the Welsh tale of Taliesin that has the same motif, so it's coming up again and again, and yes, as Michael is saying, all across Europe, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's more widespread than that.
It's a very weirdly specific motif that's kind of all over.
Yeah.
Although, would you describe Taliesin as as a warrior character in the same way?
No, that's true. I would not do that. But as far as burning a finger in his
absolutely,
case,
yeah.
And gaining supernatural knowledge from it, that piece absolutely applies.
It's exactly the same.
Let's go ahead and return to looking at Ogam specifically. I think we might want to talk about what the date range of these is, what the function of these is.
Now we're getting into archaeology questions. This is my bread and butter. This is actually a topic very, very close to my heart. Ogam stones specifically were the topic of my undergraduate dissertation research. So, as we mentioned, Ogam, the earliest form of writing in Ireland that we know of. How is it preserved? How have we found it? Well, we found it inscribed on stones. There are theories as to how it developed, and perhaps people were inscribing Ogam onto wood, like we saw in that scene in the Tawn. That's actually one of the pieces of evidence that people point to for maybe Ogam was being written on wood. It seems very logical, but obviously wood isn't something that is preserved very well. Fingers crossed we find some slab of wood in a bog with Ogam on it. Actually, not impossible to do that, but for the most part, wood would not survive for 2,000 years, 1,500 years. But stones do. Even stones left outside in a field, fallen over, rain, all the elements, whatever, they still survive. And we still have clearly human-made notches on them. And that's what an Ogam stone is. It's the stone inscribed with the Ogam alphabet to record various things. What were these stones used for? It's not wholly clear. There's a lot of potentials, but the two clearest functions that pretty much everyone agrees on is they were used for memorial stones. They were placed onto the landscape and inscribed with names of people who had likely passed away. And we'll talk about some of the evidence for that when we discuss the things that the words we find on Ogam stones. And they were likely used as boundary markers. We see in some of the law texts they're actually referenced as boundary markers and as valid ways to mark the ends of territories. So we're fairly certain that those were the two main functions of Ogam stones.
And just to refer back to our opening quote, we also get this sense of them being boundary markers in a lot of the legendary sources in that particular scene, because Cuchulainn was it's a long story, but he's the only fighter who is able-bodied in Ulster at the time. The army of Connacht is invading Ulster, and so he's having to fight them off single-handedly. But that's
because all the Ulstermen are experiencing birth pains.
Yes, and we will get to that story.
Very interesting story.
Yeah, I think we'll do a whole series on the Ulster cycle. But in this particular scene, because Cuchulainn has promised to go on this tryst, and because he's a little shit and is not willing to break a promise with a woman, because then the woman will have some social capital over him, I suppose, he sets up this Ogam ring on this stone with a warning to the Connachta army not to pass. So it is acting as a boundary marker, it's acting as a warning, it's something that actually does effectively delay them in that particular story and in that scene with what follows.
And that's not the only scene in the Ton where you see that. There are a lot of instances, in fact, all of the instances except, I think, one or two, when Cuchulainn is making Ogam inscriptions, it's to make a warning to the pursuing armies of Connacht. Usually it's, don't cross here unless you can do this feat of strength. Like, one of them was jumping over some massive tree or something in a chariot, something like that. So, don't cross this boundary unless you can do this feat. I'm warning you, don't cross this boundary. Ogam clearly being used to mark boundaries in more than just that one instance, really all over the Ton.
Yes, and I'm sure in other literature as well, but I'm sure I'll come across it sooner or later. I want to also look at the importance of Ogam from a linguistic perspective. And that may not sound super thrilling to those of you listening, but I'll keep it fairly short, and I promise it is really interesting, especially if you do have time to really sit down with it. Ogam gives us our earliest written form of the Irish language. It is generally not stones that are written in the Latin language. It is specifically in a very early form of Irish, which people will call variously primitive Irish or archaic Irish or Ogam Irish. And I think Ogam Irish is probably the most neutral option there. And this is going to be the bulk of our writing examples pre-700. We have a very small number of other types of texts that have survived that we will be looking at in our next episode, actually, from around the year 600 that are not Ogam stones, but it's mainly Ogam stones up to 700. And then after that, we get into what we call Old Irish, and we see quite a bit of linguistic difference between Ogam Irish and Old Irish. And in fact, the types of things that happen linguistically from the Ogam period into the Old Irish period are seen by many people as more significant than all the changes that have taken place from Old Irish, which was going until about the year 900, to present modern-day Irish over 1,000 years later. So that was a major linguistic shift that was happening, and we're still not quite sure what precipitated that. But I think it is incontestable that Ogam is a product of Christianity, and that it was probably Christianity and the introduction of Latin that had something to do with those linguistic changes that took place. Another text that we looked at before, the Autogept Nonagis, the Scholar's Primer, also tells us a little bit about Ogam. We looked at this text when we were talking about the legendary origins of the Irish language. As far as Ogam is concerned, the Scholar's Primer has the following to say, quote, This is their number. There are 5 groups of Ogam, and each group has 5 letters, and each of them has from 1 to 5 scores, and their orientations distinguish them. Their orientations are right of the stem line, left of the stem line, across the stem line, through the stem line, around the stem line. Ogam is climbed, i.e. read, as a tree is climbed, i.e. treading on the root of the tree first, with one's right hand before one and one's left hand last. After that, it is across it and against it and through it and around it." End quote. Again, this is from McManus's A Guide to Ogam. We've mentioned that Ogam is a writing system that uses these marks, these scores, these
linear slashes.
Yeah, linear slashes, mostly horizontal slashes, as well as sometimes dots. And what the Scholar's Primer is talking about is it's talking about the direction in which Ogam is read. You're not reading it from top to bottom like you might expect, or from left to right. You're reading it from bottom to top like a tree is climbed. The stem line that it mentions is that there is this usually, well, imaginary is not quite the right word, but usually a line that is defined by the edge of an Ogam stone. So a lot of, well, there's like Ogam text generators online and things like that, and it will just put this vertical line that all the little Ogam marks will come off of, either going horizontally to the right or horizontally to the left, or going through the stem line. And that stem line would not have been drawn on the actual Ogam stones themselves. Instead, they form these marks on either side of the edge of a stone, and that is the stem line we're talking about.
Which makes sense, because when you're carving on a stone, you want the fewest number of lines to be carved as possible.
Yes, it's hard to carve into stone. Another piece of circumstantial evidence for why wood was very likely something they might have used, but hasn't survived, of course. And then what the Scholar's Primer is saying about there being these 5 groups of Ogam is that we get marks, these scores that are horizontally to the right of the stem line. That's one group. And we get a single score, for example, representing the letter B. We get 2 scores to the right representing L, 3 scores to the right representing F, and so on, up to 5 marks.
It's kind of like Morse code. If instead of, dots and dashes, it were just slashes that were oriented with respect to some center line.
Yes, exactly. So we have that group that's all to the right. We have a group that's all to the left. We have a group that goes through the stem line, so it cuts across. And then the vowels are usually represented either by much shorter horizontal lines that go through the stem line, or even by dots on the stem line. And again, they're all groups of through 5. So that's 4 groups. The 5th group we'll talk about in a minute. But something else that the Scholar's Primer gives us is something that has led to what I would say is a over-enthusiastic interpretation in the modern era of this idea of a Irish tree alphabet, and the idea that's been around since the Celtic revival of a secret druidic script. Well, the medieval writers were not entirely immune to this mysticization of the early Ogam text, because with the Scholar's Primer, for instance, we get sections of it that are perhaps as early in origin as about the year 800, but that's still a couple of centuries past the use of Ogam in stone. And so we get this romanticization, I would say almost, where the scribe of the Autogepna Negus ascribes these plant names to each individual letter of the Ogam alphabet. So we get the letter B, called Betha, being associated with the birch tree, for instance. The letter L, Lewis, is associated with the rowan, and so on. And we get this whole list of different trees or various plants that are associated with each symbol. This is known as the arboreal tradition. But linguists in the modern day have worked out that less than half of these glosses in the Scholar's Primer match the true etymology of the names of each of these characters. So, for example, Nyun, which the Scholar's Primer the letter N in the Ogam alphabet, the Scholar's Primer says that it represents the ash tree, when originally the etymology is something more like a fork or a loft. And on the letter O, which the Scholar's Primer says represents gorse, is actually the one that should be connected to the ash tree. So, they were kind of on the right track. There are a lot of these letters that etymologically seem to come from plants and trees, but not all of them do, and they mixed some of them up.
Speaking of the Ogam script, just some background facts about the script itself and how we understand it today beyond just what the Scholar's Primer suggests. A lot of the modern understanding, the modern consensus, comes from Damian McManus and his research into Ogam. He wrote A Guide to Ogam, and it really is the best guide to Ogam there is. It makes really convincing arguments for its development, its linguistic nature, all of that stuff. Would highly recommend if you're interested in this. And he argued very convincingly that Ogam script is based on the Latin alphabet. And I say argued because that was not always a fact that was widely accepted. In fact, the first scholar who really did modern academic research into Ogam, R.A.S. McAllister, big name in the field.
He's the one who we've been quoting for all our Levergovala stuff.
He was the first one to really, he traveled all around Ireland and catalogued every single, at that point, known Ogam stone in the Irish countryside in Corpus Inscriptionum Insularum Celticarum, if anyone wants to see that. And his theory, his original theory, was that Ogam may have derived from an early system of secretive communication used by Celtic peoples in late antiquity. I think he was the one that said that. I don't want to misattribute it. Other theories have also been posited that Ogam script comes from the Greek alphabet, that Ogam script comes from Icelandic runes, which you can certainly understand because these two kinds of secretive, mystical scripts. And remember, a lot of these theories are coming out of the Celtic revival, as we just mentioned, which is influenced by these notions similar to the Scholar's Primer. However, based on linguistic evidence, based on a lot of really strong evidence, McManus has pretty definitively shown, no, Ogam is based on the Latin alphabet. McManus also argued that Ogam was developed in probably around the late 4th century by the earliest Christian inhabitants of Ireland, or at least based on the intellectual exchange that the inhabitants of Ireland were having with the continent. Remember that the earliest Ogam stones are from around 400 CE and then go through until the 8th century. So the timing works out very well for this theory. And late 4th century, early 5th century, that's just when the first Christians are entering Ireland. Again, this was not always the consensus. A lot of people, including McAllister, really believed that Ogam developed as a written script prior to the introduction of Christianity, and then was influenced certainly by Christian ideas coming in, but that it developed potentially much earlier, especially with the possibility of it being inscribed in wood. This is all academic debate, and there's going to be a million theories going around, but the consensus has really come more towards the McManus side, the McManus school of thought here, that Ogam was probably developed out of intellectual exchange with continental Christianity, developing in the late 4th century, and inspired by the adoption of a book-based religion. When you have something like the Bible, you need to be able to write and to read. And when you have the Irish language and the need to read, now you develop, it's a clear, intellectual, logical chain to the development of writing.
I guess to just give some substance to some of the more recent arguments about why most scholars nowadays think that Latin was the primary driver, the primary source on which Ogam was based. We have Latin grammarians who were operating in the 2nd through 4th centuries who over that period attempted to differentiate the sounds of Latin, the individual phonemes of each letter, into different categories. So they had the vocales, the vowels, the semivocales, F, L, M, N, R, S and X, the mutae, B, C, D, G, H, K, P, Q, and T, and then the Greek letters Y and Z. And this idea that they separated into these particular categories, they don't correspond exactly to those groupings in the Ogam that we mentioned, the 5 groupings, but they do correspond fairly closely in a lot of ways. And if we were to take the Latin alphabet, strip out the letters that are not used in Irish, and work with what's left, the categories that the Ogam are put into, where we have the ones that are to the left of the stem line or the ones that are to the right of the stem line and so on, map fairly closely to what the Latin grammarians were doing. And so it seems to be an adaptation of Latin grammatical practices in addition to the fact that we can transcribe symbol for letter from Ogam markings into Latin letters.
Yeah, there's no real argument anymore as to whether it's Latin or Greek or runes. It's everyone pretty much agrees. Yeah, it's definitely Latin. Probably around late 4th century, maybe a little earlier, but around then, definitely influenced by Christianity. But of course, as with anything in academia, it will have developed out of a very strong debate.
Right. So just to give listeners a picture in their mind of what a very simple word in Ogam might look like, something that I think people can actually have in their minds and not have to go look it up. Though I do recommend doing a quick Google search of Ogam, or going to like the Ogam in 3D project website if you want to look in more detail. But just to give you an idea of how it worked, how different words were formed, if you picture in your mind now a vertical line that is the edge of a pillar stone. And at the bottom of the edge of this pillar stone, at the bottom of this stem line that we're calling this vertical edge, there is a mark, a single mark that goes to the right. Above that, there are 5 dots. And above the 5 dots, there are 5 horizontal lines, one on top of the other, that go through the stem line. Okay, so from the bottom to the top, we have 1 mark to the right, 5 dots on the stem line, 5 slashes through the stem line. Okay, so with that image in your head, we're going to read this from bottom to top. We read Ogam like we're climbing a tree. So the first mark to the right is the letter B. The dots are a vowel, and 5 of them is the letter I. And then the 5 slashes or horizontal scores through the stem line represent the consonant R. So we have B-I-R, which is bur. This is the Old Irish word for a stake or a spit. So just to give you an idea of how it works and demystify it a little. But as far as the content of what's actually written on these Ogam stones, what are we usually finding, Michael?
In the vast majority of Ogam stones, all you will see are names.
Mm-hmm.
Personal names, sometimes with tribal identifiers, often with parents' names, X son of Y. But for the vast majority, I don't know the exact percentages, but probably 90%, something like that. It will just be
95.
If not 95%, it will just be a single name or maybe 2 names. Or at least that's what has survived.
Yes.
Because remember, these stones have undergone a lot of weathering. There's a lot of the slashes that are missing are hard to see. So perhaps there are a lot of single name stones that used to have double names. But
yes.
All that being said, almost all names.
And for those vast majority of stones which feature personal names, 99% of those, if not 99.9% of those, are the names of men. We do have at least one example of a Ogam stone that we'll look at in a little bit that I believe is in Wales with the name of a daughter of someone. But usually these are the names of men. And just as a single example, there is a stone from Ardmore in County Waterford that reads Lugadekis maki makwa netasagamonis, which would be translated something like the stone of Lugith, son of blank. There's a place that we can't read, of the tribe of Nath Segamon or Segavon.
This, by the way, is why one of the many reasons why it's fairly agreed that Ogam stones were likely one of their primary functions was as memorial stones. When you have a bunch of standing stones that have names inscribed to them, the clear purpose is to memorialize someone.
Mm-hmm. Though it also is equally possible, and as we mentioned earlier in the episode, that these could be stones that are used to mark boundaries, and so it could just as easily be a stone that's showing this is a boundary marker for the territory of the person who's named on this stone.
Exactly. I'll also say, in reference to this stone at Ardmore, I believe this stone is found in an abbey or a monastery, some ecclesiastical building. And we'll talk about the distribution of Ogam stones in a few minutes, but just to put this idea in people's heads, about a third of Ogam stones are found in ecclesiastical places, in abbeys or monasteries, places like that, or associated specifically with ecclesiastics, priests, etc. We sometimes find priest names on Ogam stones.
Yeah, in fact, we have an Ogam stone with a word for priest or another ecclesiastical order of some kind. Cremator is, I think, something like that. That translates as an ecclesiastical rank. It actually has that title on the stone in addition to the name. The fifth category, the fifth grouping of Ogam that I mentioned earlier and said we'd come back to, are known as the forfeda, the additional letters. And these are pretty much never actually used on stone. They are much more complicated. They would be quite hard to carve effectively. There's one that looks kind of like a grid or a hashtag almost that stands for the diphthong AE. There's another one that looks like a couple of overlapping X's that stands for IA. There's another. All of these are diphthongs. All of them are two vowels that form a sound together. And there's one that's kind of sort of like a square spiral, one that's like a diamond, and then one that's just an X across the stem line. And you do occasionally get Ogam stones with the EA symbol, that's just the simple X across the stem line, but that's really the only one you ever find on stones themselves. So why would we even have these in the first place? Well, because Ogam didn't stay on stones exclusively. It did transition into early medieval manuscripts where scribes and scholars and clerics were still really interested in the idea of Ogam. And it was, as we looked at in that story about Ogma being the inventor of Ogam, it was sort of a symbol of how learned you were if you could work with Ogam. So when we find Ogam in manuscripts, and typically in these cases it's turned sideways so that you're reading it left to right, you'd have to kind of turn the page 90 degrees anti-clockwise to read it from bottom to top. But this is known as ecclesiastical Latin, Ogam. And that is where you get these forfeda symbols the most commonly. So as far as this idea of the content of Ogam stones being primarily names, it's not only names, but there are specific formulas that we tend to find. Again, very commonly, we just get a simple personal name, nothing else, that's it. But we also frequently get the format X, so someone's name, Makwi, Y, and Y is someone else's name, so X, Y, Z, right, are going to stand in for names. So X, Makwi, Y, X, son of Y. Anyone who has modern Irish, or really anyone who knows anything about Irish surnames, will recognize Mac or Mac as a name for, or a word for son of. Makwi is an older form of that word. It's the primitive Irish or the archaic or the Ogam Irish form of mock. And it's in the genitive case. Pretty much all of these, for anyone who has any linguistics, you don't get the actual form of the names when you look at an Ogam stone. You get the possessive form of the names, which is a little different. So Makwi is something that in its base form would be something like Makwus. But when we get the personal name at the beginning of a stone, it's really saying not, for example, Lugith, it's really of Lugith.
It would be like if I had an Ogam stone and it said Michael's.
Yes, Michael apostrophe S. Or if you had a stone and it said of Michael.
Right.
Even more directly. And so what goes in front of the of, most people assume stone of. So picturing your head a stone that says of Michael, and you read that as the stone of Michael. Hey, that's all I'm trying to say there. So we have X Makwi Y. We have X Makwi Y Mukwa Z. Mukwa means of the tribe of. Then we have X Avi Z, where Avi means descendant of. You might use that if your grandfather or great-grandfather or something is super famous, but maybe your dad isn't so much.
That, by the way, is where the O comes from in modern Irish.
Yes.
O'Connor.
So we have names like McCarthy. That Mac comes from the same Makwi or Mukwos, and Avi becomes O, meaning grandson of in modern Irish, or really in older Irish, and it's fossilized in modern Irish. We occasionally, not very often, but occasionally get onum blank, and in modern Irish, onum means name. So it could be name of, but I like the idea that has been proposed that it should be translated as soul of. We have the word anima in Latin, which has that kind of, or animus in Latin, which has that kind of idea of mind or heart or soul. So the soul of X, and that one works particularly well for the idea of these being memorial markers. And then finally, we do get very occasionally, and these were super useful back in the early days of trying to interpret these darn Ogam stones, but bilingual inscriptions where we have the Ogam markings, and we also have etched into the stone actual Latin letter forms that are giving us the Latin translation of the Ogam markings. For a few examples of what these might look like, we have a stone that says Daligni Makwidali, translated as something like the stone of Dalignos, son of Dalos. We have Degas Maki Makwa Toikaki, of Dag, the son of the tribe of Toikakis. Maki Karatini Avi Inequaklis, of Macarthan, descendant of Eneklish. And then Lugadekis Maki Makwa Koi Nedesagamonis, as we already mentioned, the stone of Lugith, son of the tribe of Noth Segavon. To give you an idea of how we get from the Ogam Irish forms of these names to the Old Irish forms of the names, I can give you a few examples in English of some of the linguistic processes that take place that actually naturally occur in the English language in just how we speak it. One of the things that happens, one of the most important things that happens, is something called apocope, where we lose the last syllable, usually, of the original Ogam Irish word as it transitions into Old Irish. So with the case of the word Makwi or Makwus, that just becomes mock. In English, this happens with things like nicknames. So we have the name Barbara becomes Barb for a lot of different Barbaras out there. We also have examples from like older English into modern English. You know how you go in rounding, you see people trying to make their English look fancy and medieval, and they'll write old with an E on the end, olda. That becomes old in the transition, and that's from apocope. We lose that eh at the end of the word as we transition to modern English. So that's apocope, and with the name Makwi Karatini, for instance, that's going to become mock karatin through that process of apocopy. We also have the idea of lenition, of medial consonants, and we've mentioned lenition a few times. It's the softening of a sound. When you have a consonant between two vowels, that tends to soften it. So with makwi karatini again, apocopy brings that to mak karatin, but lenition of that T that's in there, the karatini, the karatin, that T is going to soften to a th sound, so it's going to become macarthin. And finally, we have syncope, which is when we lose a medial syllable. We lose usually just a vowel between a couple of consonants, and they just sort of smash together. So an English example is the contraction didn't. That comes from did not, and we lose the O to produce didn't. That is an example of syncope.
My favorite example is comfortable. No one says comfortable unless maybe you're British and very fancy and very posh. Comfortable. Yeah. You lose that sound.
Yes, exactly. Oh, I meant to give an example of the lenition happening in English as well. So I gave you macarthin for the Old Irish form of macaratini, but for an English example of lenition, when I taught briefly in England when I was doing my student internship, and I had the hardest time, because I taught mathematics, believe it or not, I had the hardest time telling when students were telling me the number 13 or 30, because they say their T's very strongly in British English with your numbers. While in American English, you don't say 30 or 30, you say 30 with a D sound, 30. That T has been lenited, it's been softened to a D sound instead. So there's an example of that lenition happening there. So the point of this is that all these different processes combine together to create this very dramatic difference where we're no longer the son of Karatini, Maki Karatini, we're now the son of Macarthin.
And all of these processes together, these things didn't happen at one point in time. There was not, some great council of all Irish speakers that came together and said, all right, we're going to chop off all the endings of words. They were linguistic processes over time. And so this allows us, scholars of archaic Irish, to actually linguistically date Ogam stones. Because otherwise, stone isn't something you can necessarily date using other archaeological methods like radiocarbon dating. Perhaps you could do something with relative position, but you can't date an Ogam stone with classical archaeological methods. So instead, what people do is they examine the words in the stone, the names in the stones, and look to see, is there evidence of apocopy going on here? Do we have the name Karatini or Carthin? Is there evidence of syncope here? Do you have Maki or Mak? There's a stone in Araglen. It reads, Cremater Ronan Mak Comagan. So in that case, instead of having Makwi from Makwos, you just have Mak. So that's a stone where apocopy has already happened. Do you see evidence of syncope? Do you see evidence of lenition on the stone itself? And that can tell scholars this stone was probably written between 600 to 650, between 650 to 700. The ranges are fairly approximate because it's hard to know exactly what was going on at exactly what time 1500 years ago. But it does give ranges for when these stones were written based solely on the linguistic evidence, which is something I find very cool, that you can date an archaeological artifact linguistically. Now I think we're going to shift gears a bit, having now discussed kind of the background of Ogam, how it's translated, what it looks like, all of those things. Now we're going to talk about some of the larger properties of Ogam stones in aggregate. And specifically, we're going to talk about the distribution of Ogam around Ireland. There are a few hundred Ogam stones, around 300, 400 Ogam stones extant. The vast majority of them, about 70% of Ogam stones, are in the three southernmost counties of Ireland. That would be Carey, Cork, and Waterford, with the large plurality in Carey. and then quite a few in Cork, still a lot in Waterford. And then from Waterford, there's kind of a trail going up north towards Dublin of Ogam stones, fewer and fewer as you go. And then from Dublin out west towards Roscommon, there are a handful of Ogam stones there. So that's kind of the distribution around Ireland. The vast majority in the south, and then up towards Dublin, west towards Roscommon, forming this kind of bottom-heavy backwards C.
And we do get a very small number in Northern Ireland as well.
Now, there are some explanations for this. This has been noticed and discussed in the scholarly literature. What could explain this distribution, this very clear, non-uniform distribution in Ireland? One argument that I've seen that I found quite convincing, I forget who was the one who said this, so hopefully someone can find this for me and cite it among the listeners. Someone had mentioned that there was a tribe native to the south of Ireland who also had connections to the west of Britain. And we'll talk about in a few minutes the Ogam stones found outside of Ireland, several of them found on the British island. And this tribe seemed to have connections, seemed to potentially have settled in parts of the west of Britain, particularly the parts where we find a lot of Ogam stones. And by a lot, I mean, a few dozen, not as many as in Ireland. So I found it quite convincing that perhaps this tribe to the south, in the south of Ireland and in these parts of Britain, they were the ones who were really associated with Ogam stones that would explain this distribution. And then you have a few Ogam stones here and there elsewhere in Ireland just due to intellectual exchange, etc. But I found that argument pretty convincing, though ultimately the explanation for this distribution has not been settled. There's no clear consensus as to why are Ogam stones distributed like this across Ireland. Now, fun fact, examining the distribution of Ogam stones in Ireland was actually the focus of my research of my undergraduate dissertation. So something I'm very interested in, something that I've looked into a lot, and something that I revisited. We mentioned a couple episodes ago that Tyler and I were at the Celtic Students Conference in Brest, France. And this is the research that I was presenting on there. So Tyler suggested that we take a few minutes of this episode and just talk about that research, which made me very happy.
It's really interesting stuff, Michael, so I'm excited for you to give us the rundown.
Thank you very much. To be perfectly honest, as I was re-examining it for the Celtic Students Conference, I became a little less convinced as to the significance of the results, and I'll explain why I say that in a minute. But hopefully the listeners will enjoy hearing about this. We talked about some of the arguments in the debates as to the development of Ogam. And those arguments, that debate is very related to another big question in Ogam studies, which is, how do we classify Ogam? Should we classify it as Christian or pre-Christian in nature? Or perhaps more broadly, Christian or non-Christian in nature? Because on the one hand, Ogam developed out of the Latin language, developed through the same intellectual exchange that brought Christianity, may very well have been developed by the first Christians in Ireland in their adoption of this book-based religion. So that's kind of all pointing to Ogam is a potentially Christian development. But on the other hand, Ogam stones are standing stones. Standing stone construction was a long-standing feature of prehistoric Ireland. The earliest standing stones that we've been able to date all the way back from the 3rd millennium BCE, so ridiculously old. They are kind of the characteristic site type of prehistoric Ireland, standing stones and various kinds of mounds. Additionally, there's evidence of Christian iconoclasm and vandalism of Ogam stones. We have a lot of Ogam stones where, I shouldn't say a lot, but a few Ogam stones where crosses have been inscribed into them. And in fact, even Celtic tribal names have been defaced on, I think, at least one Ogam stone, which really points to this iconoclasm, this vandalism going on. And again, there are the arguments that Ogam may have developed prior to the introduction of Christianity and was originally inscribed on wood that doesn't survive, though that argument is slightly less favored in the current scholarly consensus.
Similar to the idea that you're talking about with the Ogam stones that are defaced with Christian symbols, we don't get Ogam in the Celtic country known as Brittany, the Western Peninsula in France, where we went to that conference, but we do get Neolithic standing stones and other Neolithic monuments that are similarly Christianized, oftentimes by topping them with crosses, if not carving them into it. And it's just this very similar feature happening not too far away across the water that I think is worth pointing out, because in those cases, well, there are occasions where we don't necessarily know the origins of a Ogam stone before it was carved upon, whether it might have been part of a Neolithic site or not, because it may have been moved, or the Neolithic site may no longer remain and we just have the Ogam stone, whatever, what have you. We do, in the case of Brittany, generally have a good sense for specifically these were Neolithic monuments that were Christianized later because usually of their location and proximity to other Neolithic structures.
That's really interesting. I had no idea about that. I know absolutely nothing about Breton stuff.
Go to the summer school. It'll do you good.
Oh, that's very cool. So all of this together, there's this big question. Should we say that Ogam stones are Christian artifacts, or that Ogam script is a Christian idea? Or are they pre-Christian? Are they associated with pre-Christian practices? That was the main question, main driving question that I was interested in researching. The way I went about this as a student of archaeology is by looking at the spatial properties of Ogam stones, doing what's called a GIS analysis. GIS is a common acronym in archaeology. It stands for Geographic Information Science or Geographic Information Systems. It's a variety of tools that you can use to look at the geospatial positions of sites and finds and artifacts and things and try and make important conclusions. A classic example of what you can do with GIS is if you were a researcher of Paleolithic civilizations and found a Paleolithic village that has a bunch of scatterings of stone tool debitage, stone tool refuse, essentially, all the little cracked pieces of stone that you make. You can do a geospatial analysis of all of these little finds in your small village and potentially be able to say, well, based on the distribution of all of these finds, they were probably making the tools over there. They were throwing out all of the scraps over there, and they were getting the materials for the tools from, way over at the stream bed over there. So these are common tools in an archaeologist's toolbox for analysis of finds. In addition to Ogam stones, a very common site type in Ireland is, as I mentioned, prehistoric mounds, prehistoric burial mounds. Now, these are obviously pre-Christian in nature. They were made before Christianity. They are burial mounds, therefore associated with mortuary practice, mortuary ritual. So I was curious, what is the spatial relationship between Ogam stones, this artifact type that we want to figure out how we ought to classify them, and pre-Christian mortuary sites, clearly sites associated with pre-Christian ritual? So the way I went about this analysis was to understand the potential relationship between Ogam stones and these pre-Christian burial mounds. I was just curious, how far apart are they from each other? I felt like that was the simplest way to know, is there a relationship? Are they close to each other? Okay, so for each Ogam stone, I found the closest pre-Christian burial mound. And just for the sake of being able to say it easily, the way I'm going to refer to it is sheath mounds or she mounds. She is the modern Irish word related to the Old Irish word sheathe, meaning other world, meaning a lot of different things. There's a lot of literature on the word she, just the word she, but essentially otherworld mound, because in modern folklore, these mounds are associated with otherworldly aspects. Fairy hills, fairy mounds, you'll often hear them called. So she mounds. When you hear she mound, think pre-Christian burial site. For each Ogam stone, I found the closest she mount and calculated the distance between them, which isn't hard to do using GIS software. Then I aggregated all of these distances and plotted them to look at them. And it makes this nice little histogram of this many are 1 kilometer away from the closest she mound, this many Ogam stones are 2 kilometers away, etc. If anyone is familiar with statistics, it looks like a gamma distribution. Okay, so
really easy to Google an image of a gamma distribution if you just want to see.
It's a very, very common distribution in natural phenomena. You'll find it all over the place. Okay, so how should I make sense of this histogram, this data? What does it mean? Is it significant that there are this many that are 1 kilometer, this many stones that are 1 kilometer away, or this many that are 2? Well, one thing that you often see in statistical analysis is random simulation, often called Monte Carlo methods, various ways of comparing real data with randomly simulated data to see how likely was this pattern to have come about from random processes. And if you can find that, well, it's very unlikely that it came about from random processes, you can make important conclusions from that. So what I did was randomly simulate Ogam stone locations. Again, something you can do fairly easily with GIS software. So there were, I forget how many Ogam stone sites in my analysis, but a few hundred. So in the Irish island, unfortunately, I didn't have the data for Northern Ireland, so this was just in the Republic, coming from a wonderful repository of geospatial data called the Historic Environment Viewer. For anyone interested in GIS archaeology in Ireland, this is the place for you. So what I did was, using GIS software, select a few hundred random points around the Republic of Ireland to simulate Ogam stones. To imagine, well, what if Ogam stones had just been littered randomly across Ireland? And then I repeated the whole process again, calculated the distance from these hypothetical Ogam stones to the nearest she mounds. Then I repeated that whole thing 100 times. So you get 100 sets of simulated coordinates, 100 sets of distances, and aggregated them, averaged them, take their standard deviations, all of that wonderful statistical stuff.
I love that computers can do that for us.
I do not envy the people who are doing this stuff by hand.
Did you have to do any of that by hand when you were first learning statistics? Because I did.
Yes.
Though not with that quantity.
No, I think it was, an experiment with maybe 10 measurements is what we had to do. So it was not hard to do the chi-square analysis for that.
Yeah.
In any case. Now I have the real archaeological data, a gamma distribution histogram, and the 100 sets of aggregated, simulated, random data, which was also, as it happens, a gamma distribution. Unsurprisingly, again, gamma distributions pop up all over, and we wouldn't expect the two distributions to be that crazy different. Now, the way that you can compare two statistical distributions in this kind of analysis is using something called a chi-square test. The theory behind it is, a little mathematical, but the gist of it is it asks the question, what is the probability that these two sets of data were drawn from the same larger set of data? In other words, what is the probability that these two distributions are the same? That's kind of the basic question that you ask with a chi-square test. And when you run the chi-square test with the real archaeological data and the random simulated data, you find that they are, with a p-value that indicates statistical significance, different. And not just different, but different in a specific way. The numbers in the archaeological data set, in the aggregate, tends to be smaller than the numbers in the randomly simulated data set. And remember that the numbers in these data sets are distances between she mounds and Ogam stones. So, on average, the distance between real Ogam stones and she mounds is smaller. They are closer together than a random sampling, a random simulation would suggest. Now, before we celebrate about, a result being found.
Darn, I was going to pull out the party poppers.
Remember that Ogam stones are not distributed across Ireland uniformly, which is what my random simulation was assuming. It was just essentially picking random points across all of the Republic of Ireland. But 70% of Ogam stones are just found in the bottom 3 counties. And for a variety of reasons, this could have skewed the data. So let's repeat the whole thing, but just focusing on those bottom 3 counties. So there are, I think now 200 or so Ogam stones in just these 3 counties. So there will be in each of the 100 randomly selected simulated data sets, 100 pretend Ogam stones just in these 3 counties. And you repeat the whole thing, and actually the p-value is even smaller. The 2 distributions, when compared using a chi-square test, are even more different. The real Ogam stones are even closer to she-mounds than the random simulation would suggest.
Do you have those p-values on hand just to
I do.
Scratch my statistic nerd curiosity?
So the p-value for the first one, the whole of the Republic, was 0.027.
Oh yeah, that's pretty good.
And the p-value for the second one is less than 0.001.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yes.
Which is really good. And what these p-values mean is what is the likelihood that these 2 distributions are the same? What is the likelihood that the data from these 2 histograms is drawn from the same base distribution? So about 0.1%. So very unlikely in the second case, and also in the first case that they were drawn from the same data. So what does this mean? Well, it sounds really nice when I say Ogam stones are, in the aggregate, placed closer to pre-Christian mortuary sites than a random sampling would suggest. Can we say that Ogam stones were built purposely close to she-mounds? That would be incredible. That would be amazing. Ogam stones were being placed so that they had this spatial relationship with pre-Christian burial sites, sites associated with pre-Christian mortuary ritual. That would be incredible. That would be very interesting. That's not what we can say. Unfortunately, that would be awesome. All we can say is that these sites are closer together than a random sampling would suggest. The Ogam stones were most likely not placed randomly across the landscape. But obviously, Ogam stones were not placed randomly across the landscape. Their locations were chosen for presumably a variety of reasons. One of them likely being they were placed where they are because that location is close to where people lived. So consider this counter-argument. Perhaps Ogam stones and she-mounds are close together because they both happen to be close to where people live. And then the random sampling that we did doesn't account for where people live. So obviously the distances are going to be smaller in real life. So that's just one example of why we should be careful with the conclusions we draw from this data. That's one of the reasons why, upon re-examining this research, I was less excited, or
less convinced
still excited,
by your own
less convinced by my own arguments. Though I wasn't. I was never trying to argue for crazy things. But that's just one very clear, very logical reason why, for a lot of statistical analysis in archaeology and in fields beyond archaeology, you have to be really careful about what conclusions you make, because you can often say things that sound almost correct and sound really, really crazy cool, really interesting, but aren't quite what the data and what the statistical tests are saying.
You get this in modern day media all the time, where different studies and statistics will be spun in a particular direction, and it just takes a little critical thinking to realize this is an interpretation that those statistics only back up to a very limited degree. So we do have to be really careful. But Michael, what it sounds like to me is that we need to just do a repeat of the study you've already done, either with the random data set somehow restricted, and this would take a lot of work, I think, but somehow restricted to places where people were, and or it is something that could be repeated with doing the same study where you're not comparing to distances to Shiva, but instead comparing distances to early ecclesiastical centers, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. I would love to repeat this. The first solution you mentioned of accounting for where people are living, where people are likely placing these things, that's a strategy in GIS that people use all the time for a variety of reasons to answer a lot of different questions. And you can do that. It's hard. And it carries with its own problems, because now you have to, I guess for lack of a better word, you have to make some editorial decisions.
Yes.
You have to say, well, if the environmental factors are like this, that makes it more likely that people were living here. Mm-hmm. If the elevation is this high and the visibility is this good and the access to water is X number of miles away, in these strategies, you use those kinds of factors to create essentially a probability distribution of what is the likely places that you would put these things for environmental factors or based on the environment. And in designing that probability distribution, you, the researcher, have to make choices of it's this likely when the slope is this high, which I think is perfectly acceptable and a very valid way to go about this research. But you have to be aware that now there are non-mathematical decisions being made.
Yes.
Of course, another way to go about it would be just basing it off population, of where's the population highest. But that's difficult too, because then you have to go off of population estimates for 500 CE, 600 CE, which are obviously difficult to make, and again, make a lot of these assumptions. This is not to say this would not be a valid question to answer. My plan for this in the future is to do precisely that. But in any of these kinds of analyses, you have to be aware of what assumptions you're making when you're going about them.
It sounds like something that could easily turn into a full PhD.
Count me in. Find me the funding.
All right. Anyone out there who's listening who has money to give for a PhD, get in touch. Our email is in our link tree, which is in the podcast description. fabulaceltica@gmail.com. You don't have to contact us just for funding. You can contact us for other things too. Come say hi.
I've now been yapping a bit about the statistical side of my research.
Well, I have a place we can take this that's still dealing with distribution, but now moving outside of Ireland. And you mentioned this earlier, this connection between Ogam stones in Ireland, but also some of these pop up in Britain. Specifically, what we see is that the places that Ogam stones pop up in Britain are places that we know about some historical connections between population groups across the Irish Sea. So we have groups such as the Daoise in the southern parts of Ireland, where we have that center of Ogam stone distributions. And there were population movements between where they were living in southern Ireland and also in South Wales, right across the water. And South Wales, in fact, is the main center of Ogam stones in Britain. That's where we tend to get the most of them. We get some in North Wales, but not nearly as many. We also get some in Cornwall, but again, not nearly as many. And in Scotland, though we do get Ogam stones, they tend to not be Ogam stones that are using the Irish language. They tend to be doing some other things that I don't want to get into now because I don't know enough about it. But there's a few enough number of them, and there's some strange things happening up there that I'm not going to even touch. Focusing on the ones in Britain and Cornwall, here are places where we get a couple of our bilingual inscriptions on our Ogam stones. One instance, one that I mentioned or hinted at earlier, is our single case that I'm aware of, at least, of a woman's name on an Ogam stone. In Carmarthenshire, in Wales, there is an Ogam stone which reads in Ogam, Ovatorigus Inigena Conigni, and also written on the side of the stone rather than the edge of the stone, the flat side of it, in Latin letters, we have Ovatoria Filia Conigni. So this would translate as something like, so we have an Irish language version of this name, and we have a Latin version of this name, and it would translate to something like Avatoria or Avatorigia, the daughter of Cynegos. And that name of this Avatoria's father is cognate with the Welsh name Cynnin and the Old Irish name Conan, which is a name that we still see to this day. Another bilingual inscription found in Castell Duirin in Carmarthenshire as well is a commemoration of a king by the name of Votaporicus, or Votacorrigus. The Old Welsh name for this king, so we have Ogam version, and then we have the Latin version. That's why I'm giving two slightly different pronunciations for that name. In Old Welsh, this name becomes something like Gwartapur, and in Middle Welsh, something like Gwrthyfr, who was a 6th century king of Dyfed. So that gives us something of a dating indicator as well. We do have some bilingual stones in Ireland as well. They're not only over in Britain. So there's one, for instance, at Kilmalcader in County Carey, though I don't have the transcribed version of that readily handy for me. A lot of our Ogam stones, one problem that we come across is they're not always in their original locations. And I'm sure that was probably an issue when you were doing your research, Michael, is deciding which Ogam stones you were going to even use as data points in the first place, because some of them we don't necessarily know where they were originally placed.
Yeah, the reuse of Ogam stones it's a really interesting topic. Honestly, reuse in general is a really interesting topic. You find all over the world, or I should say in a lot of places where Christianization has occurred, you find reuse of pre-Christian sites for Christian purposes. I know in, I believe, Mexico, there are some native temples that have been built upon, that have churches built on them. In the literature, a lot of people think that a lot of she-mounds were reused as locations for churches. In Ireland, a lot of Zoroastrian temples were reused for churches. This is a phenomenon all over. And you can understand why reusing pre-Christian sites, or I should say, reusing old native sites that have some kind of political or religious power for your new regime, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or whatever new religion's coming in, whatever new belief system is coming in. It's a way of transferring that political power, that political cachet, that religious cachet that these sites have to the new belief system.
Yes, exactly what I would say about it. And so with Ogam stone specifically, we are seeing them oftentimes being, as you mentioned earlier, we had that stone that was placed at an abbey or a church, and sometimes we get them actually being used as building materials in an abbey or a church or other ecclesiastical institutions. So, for example, in Clara in County Kilkenny, we have a couple of Ogam stones, one that is used as a foundation stone at the bottom of one of the walls, another that's being used as a lintel over a door. And of course, this has the problem of oftentimes hiding the inscriptions from view, where we can only see them partially.
It's a really good question, actually. And first of all, let me go back quickly. Yeah. I'll just say, vis-a-vis my research, I actually wasn't so concerned about reuse and movement and secondary location, because I felt that, well, if they were moving the Ogam stones closer or farther away from she-mounds, that would be significant too. Though the Ogam in 3D project has been trying to identify whether Ogam stones are in their primary or secondary locations. So that question of comparing primary and secondary locations would be very, very interesting, very fascinating. But I wasn't too interested in it. But now, with regards to what you had just said, there is this constant question when you see Ogam stones being reused as building materials. Were they being reused because they are stones that are on the landscape, that are good stones, that are right there, might as well just carry it over to use in your building? Or were they being reused because they were Ogam stones? That's a constant question, and it's not always very clear. There's an example of the Cave of the Cats in Roscommon, right near the site, the massive site of Rathcrowan, which we've mentioned before. The Cave of the Cats, I forget the Irish name, Uvnagat, something like that. Or not something exactly like that.
The modern Irish name, anyways.
It's a fascinating site. It appears all over the literature as a seeming entrance to not just the otherworld, but specifically a malevolent otherworld. It has been referred to as Ireland's gate to hell. In one instance, massive hellish cats come out of it and lay waste to the landscape. In another case, magical pigs and magical birds come out and lay waste to the landscape. A lot of things come out of it and lay waste to the landscape.
Yep, and I feel like now I neglected St. Patrick's Purgatory. I should have talked about that in the previous episode because it would pair well with this. But there's an Ogam stone there, though.
There is an Ogam stone there. So in the Cave of the Cats, there's a Souterrain associated with it, which is a man-made, human-made underground structure, which has been built into this natural cave. And among the stones that have been used to build this Souterrain is, like you said, an Ogam stone. The Ogam inscription reads on it, think of Freuch, son of Medivh.
Yes.
And that's significant, and we'll come back to that in a second. The first thing that's significant, vis-a-vis the question, was this Ogam stone just used because it was a stone in the area and you need stones to build things, or was it used because it was an Ogam stone? So a researcher named John Waddell, great archaeologist, I love his research because he really combines the archaeology with the literature, which not a lot of people do, but I think for Ireland there's really great opportunities to do that, and that's what he's really interested in. He examined this cave and the Ogam stone on it very closely, and he convincingly argues that this Ogam stone was used because it was an Ogam stone. It wasn't just placed as one of the stones in the Souterrain. The Ogam stone was used as a lintel stone, kind of like the one that we just mentioned in Kilkenny. It was used as a lintel stone for a major junction in the Souterrain. And, very importantly, the Ogam stone was oriented such that the Ogam could be seen from someone entering the Souterrain. So that's one piece of evidence for this Ogam stone being important to the builders of the Souterrain because it was Ogam.
And just to add to that, you've also helped me recall that I guess we have at least two Ogam stones with a woman's name on them because Medivh is very much a woman's name. And people get really excited about this because Medivh, of course, is the name of the Queen of Connacht in the Tonbal Cúnge, in the Ulster cycle. And Rathcrogan or Cruachan is her site of, or the seat of royal power where her and her husband Alil are supposed to rule. And of course, the Cave of the Cats, Uav Nagat, is right there. It's right next to Rathcrogan Mound. So that is another reason that people get really excited about this stone in particular, and seems to be a likely driver of why whoever built this Souterrain decided to use that stone specifically.
Yeah, Waddell was making the argument and quoting, I forget whoever wrote Souterrains of Ireland, who also obviously examined this Souterrain. Both of them were making the point that this Ogam stone may have been serving a talismanic purpose. That's a difficult conclusion to reach, but you do see the logic. First of all, caves are scary, particularly this cave,
particularly when you don't have flashlights.
Exactly. Lots of scary things happen when you're reading medieval literature about caves, or they are the sites for a lot of scary things to happen, which makes sense. They're dark, they're underground. They, in this case particularly, supposedly reach a malevolent otherworld. Massive cats and birds come out to ravage Ireland.
Yeah. If you actually go into this cave and go as far back as you can in it, there is this fissure in the rock that makes it look as though it keeps going further into infinite darkness.
Oh, wow.
And so humans are too physically large to go into this fissure, but you can imagine why people back in this time would think it connects to another world.
You've been?
I have not, but there is a excellent website that has a virtual tour of it. The Visit Rathcrogan website, something like that, has a great overview of the whole Cruachan or Rathcrogan complex. And you can go into the Cave of the Cat virtually through that website. So I do recommend that.
That's very cool. I had no idea. I'll have to check that out. As for the talismanic purpose, so you have this scary cave. You have an Ogam stone that reads, of Froich, son of Medivh. Medivh being a great queen of Rathcrowan, and Froich being a heroic character as well. There's a whole other piece of literature, Toynbeg Froich, which follows a character named Froich. It's hard to say whether these are referring to the same people, but if you were an inhabitant of medieval Rathcrowan and building this Souterrain into this very scary cave, and you wanted to protect the cave, it might make sense to place an Ogam stone that calls upon, or that at least has the name of two great people, two great heroes of Connacht. So you see the logic for why this Ogam stone in particular may have been serving a talismanic purpose. And so the question always remains when you find an Ogam stone in a building, is it there because it's an Ogam stone, or is it there and happens to be an Ogam stone?
Mm-hmm. And I guess as far as the idea of a talismanic stone is concerned, again, it's functioning much like a boundary marker if that's the case. It's a protective boundary. So it ties into everything we've been talking about. To wrap this up, when we started the episode, I had talked about how there's this legendary attribution to Ogma being the creator of the Ogam alphabet, for lack of a better term. And I had also mentioned that Ogma may be connected with a continental deity, an earlier figure by the name of Ogmios. So I want to wrap up the episode by bringing us back to this idea of Ogam's inventor and talking about who this Ogmios character is in the first place. Lucian of Samosata, who was active between about the year 120 and 200 of the Common Era, says, quote, "The Celts call Heracles Ogmios in their native tongue, and they portray the god in a very peculiar way. To their notion, he is extremely old, bald-headed, except for a few lingering hairs which are quite gray. Yet, in spite of his looks, he has the equipment of Heracles. He is dressed in the lion skin, has the club in his right hand, carries the quiver at his side, displays the bent bow in his left hand, and is Heracles from top to toe as far as that goes. But I have not yet mentioned the most surprising thing in the picture. That old Heracles of theirs drags after him a great crowd of men who are all tethered by the ears. His leashes are delicate chains fashioned of gold and amber, resembling the prettiest of necklaces. Yet, though led by bonds so weak, the men do not think of escaping. In fact, they follow cheerfully and joyously." End quote. This classical writer is describing this figure that the Celts worship, and he has a lot of traits in common with Ogma. We mentioned earlier that Ogma is not only the inventor of Ogam, but he is connected with the idea of eloquence and also with having superior superhuman strength. Heracles, or Hercules, as he would be known in the Roman sources, or the Latin sources, is also a character who has great strength. And in this depiction of Ogmios, we have someone with great strength, but also with wisdom. And this depiction of these chains to the ears of the other people seems to be a very clear metaphor for the idea of eloquence. Your words are so strong that people are really paying attention to you. They're following you because of what you're saying to them. That's what these chains are likely representing.
Following cheerfully and joyously as well.
Yes. So it's really good stuff. Riveting, even. In fact, this is not just me speculating about the metaphor. Lucian continues, quote, "But let me tell you without delay what seemed to me the strangest thing of all. Since the painter had no place to which he could attach the ends of the chains, as the god's right hand already held the club and his left the bow, he pierced the tip of his tongue and represented him drawing the men by that means. Moreover, he has his face turned towards his captives and is smiling." Lucian goes on to say that a Celt then explains the image to him and says that Ogmios represents the power of logos, which is the Greek word for word or eloquence. It can mean either or. His name also appears on 2 lead cursing tablets from Austria. And these lead cursing tablets are associated with deities of the underworld. So there also is this connection to the idea of being part of an underworld. And as we've discussed in earlier episodes, the Sídha are something that connects to the Irish otherworld, which is oftentimes seen as an underworld. So we have yet another parallel in addition to Ogmios sounding a lot like Ogma, and in addition to these qualities of this very strong Hercules-like figure who is equally eloquent and powerful in that sense.
I'll also add, just to contextualize this statement by Lucian, when he says the Celts call Heracles Ogmios, what he's trying to do here is explain Celtic traditions in terms of the Greek traditions native to his readers. This is a common thing. Caesar also did this.
Yes.
When he says...
It's got its own phrase. It's the interpretatio Romano, the Roman interpretation, literally, where classical writers will, either Greek or Roman writers will say, this is like our god, so-and-so. But instead of saying like and simile, it's more, this is our god, so-and-so. They call him this, but it's really Mercury, or it's really Heracles, or what
Which makes perfect sense. They believe that these were the gods, and so the Celts would also have experienced the same gods, but they would have different names. So I think Caesar says the Celts call Mercury Lug, right? Or Lugus.
Yes, something like that, yeah.
So to him, when he goes and meets the Celts and he hears about the god Lugus, he assumes, oh, that must be Mercury because they have these similarities. And in this case, Lucian is talking to the Celts and hears about Ogmios and hears the similarities with Heracles and assumes, oh, this must be their name for Heracles, because in their mindset, there can't be two competing belief systems. It's all just one.
Yes, exactly. In fact, it reminds me of the idea of overlapping the Christian physical locations and physical structures with former pagan sites. They're assimilating these different belief systems into one and trying to create this uniformity with the past as they move towards their current understanding of their world. Any last thoughts on Ogam?
No. Thank you for indulging me and listening to all the mathematical talk.
Yeah, this will be a nice long episode to make up for the relatively shorter episode on Patrick and the coming of Christianity. In the next two episodes, we are going to turn to looking at writing in manuscripts. And we're going to talk about the importance of manuscript culture and understanding that in dealing with Celtic studies in the first place. So much of our information about the medieval period and about the beliefs of these people comes from manuscripts. And so we really have to understand how they were put together, how they have come to us to this day in order to proceed forward. And it is, again, interesting stuff. So look forward to that.
Thank you for listening to Fabula Celtica
With Tyler Baxter
and Michael Frim. Follow us at Fabula Celtica on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky, or email us at fabulaceltica@gmail.com. All right, hold on. Let me check with you the names here.
Yes.
Saltov?
Yeah.
And Feathelmouth?
Yep.
Nichruthach?
Yep.
Ho ho!
So much easier than Lochrathenius. I should mention we're recording a bunch of nonsense, but that's fine.
Oh, it's recording right now?
Yeah. It's easier to cut it.
Yeah,
later
no, I
than
can
it is
imagine than to splice it together.
Yeah. But I don't know if you had a chance to listen to the episode.
Not yet.
Okay. Make sure you listen past the sound there, the end music.
Oh, is it Kevin? Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So if we have good bloopers, I'm gonna splice them in at the end from now on.
I'm such a fan of that.
But let me tell you without delay what seemed to me the strangest man of all. But let me tell you without delay what seemed to me the strangest thing of all.
Ogam is a word. It's a. Sorry. You can cut all this, right?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Of course.
Perfect.
Again,
Little
really
key brick.
professional at not only getting rid of ums, but also getting rid of embarrassing bits of blather.
I will say, if we're willing to just have lots of blather, in the History of Japan podcast,
Yes.
which is excellent, love that. As you get on and on, you start hearing fewer and fewer ums and more discontinuous changes in pitch and tone.
I try to strategically pick the one of the 2 or 3 that met
Yeah.
that is the next one.
That's very funny.
Yeah. It's fun times.
Oh, geez. There must be so much editing that goes into this. Apologies to future Tyler editing this.
It's okay. I love to throw future Tyler under the bus. As long as present Tyler is happy, it's all good.